Welcome to Energy Chat. There's been a lot of chat recently about data centers and how they're basically blowing up electricity grids everywhere, and how loads of data centers are going into places like Virginia and all in the same sort of place. They're putting new power lines in, and how it's disrupting or maybe impacting local residents. I've been talking about this a little bit on my channel, and people have been commenting as well. So please keep commenting. I will reply to all of them. I really appreciate comments and subscribes. I want to build this into a community where we talk about energy issues and energy policy, especially. But I want to think about what I can add to the debate, given that I am an energy professional and I've worked on problems with grid operators, especially in Europe, about how to deal with new large sources of energy demand coming onto grids, especially in domestic areas or places where they have to share grid connections with lots of houses. Now, as I've said before in some other videos, domestic energy policy around the grid, so when you're at the sort of lower levels of the network in like urban centres, it's really designed around the domestic consumer and protecting their capacity. So there's a certain, let's just say it's a corporation, because it normally is, that owns the distribution part of the network, which is the part of the electricity network that you'll see in your local area around your street. And they basically have a mandate to provide energy capacity to their domestic customers as a priority. But they have a mandate to provide energy access to anyone who wants it in the local area. So if you're like a new company, you come along and you apply to them to connect to the network, and they have to look at their 5-10 year plan, and they have to see, okay, do we have enough capacity? And what capacity means is basically they're drawing energy from the larger transmission network, which is the larger network of cables that spans the whole country or region that you're in. They've got substations, which is where they take electricity at a very high voltage. It's high because high voltage is easier to transport over long distance, and they step it down to a voltage that's more manageable in domestic area. Then they might do several step downs. So the person that's responsible for the cables in your area owns several layers of what are called substations, which basically turn high voltage electricity into lower voltage electricity. Then after those substations, they own a bunch of cables that stretch out like nerves or like river branches in an estuary. Or like branches on a tree. They let it spread out into thinner and thinner lines, and eventually they connect to probably your house. But within a substation area, all those people within that have to share the capacity of that substation. So it's a piece of infrastructure made of metal, and if it's used too much, it can overheat. So it's got some sort of power rating, and it means that you can only basically import as much energy as that substation is rated to that area. And within that area, it's probably going to be a bunch of houses, and it could be some commercial units as well. So grid operators are required to provide energy with high reliability to the homeowners, and it obviously varies from country to country. But for instance, in GB right now, grid operators are fined based on hours down for domestic customers. So imagine they have like 40 domestic customers in one region. If they have underneath one substation, if they have a power cut that affects that substation, and the power's out for 2 hours, like it takes 2 hours to get an electrical engineer out to fix the substation, for example, then basically they'll get charged 40 people times 2 hours, and that'll be their fine. And these companies are heavily regulated in terms of their capex and their opex, which is how much they can invest, how much capital they can invest from their running profits every year in infrastructure, and how much capital they can invest in operating costs, which is like fixing stuff that already exists. So they've got to be very careful about how and where they buy and install new substations to increase capacity. Because of that, they've got a hard planning problem where they've got to have, if someone comes along and says, I want to start a business in a local area, and I'm going to need more electricity than the previous business that was there, or I'm building a new factory or a new warehouse or something, the grid operator's got a real hard job, because they've got to fit this new demand, which might be, okay, I'm going to build it and we're going to be operational in 1 year. They've got to fit that demand in with the rest of the growth of the area and their investment plan. And they'll have their capex regulated, as I said, so they can't spend more than a certain amount on upgrades. And then basically they'll be managed in terms of their opex. So they want to optimize. So the business is sort of managed by the regulators in terms of optimizing their operational costs. So doing repairs efficiently, not paying the staff too much, which is unfortunate. But yeah, so that's how if they do well in opex, they get more capex to spend essentially. And so these companies have got to balance the efficient running of the business with the amount that they can scale. And that means that if you get a new factory maybe in your local area, they've got a problem because they need to be able to give these people capacity. So I've worked on situations where from the corporation side, we've got a large research facility or a lab that needs a lot of energy, and we need to figure out, and maybe some electric vehicle chargers and infrastructure like that, and all those things add to the demand in the local area. We've had to figure out with the grid operator a policy that we can implement that means that we can access energy when we need it, but we're not impacting the domestic customers because they're the priority by law. And so what ends up happening is that the grid operator and the company have to come to some sort of new arrangement, because what's typically happened in the past is that a large company that has some sort of operation in a local area underneath some substation, they sometimes even have their own dedicated cables from the substation, because they've basically said, hey look, we're here, we're going to be here for decades, we need this amount of energy capacity, and they probably over subscribe it and say we need twice this much because we want to grow in the future. So that means for 10-20 years they're expecting to have capacity to grow. Nowadays, when there's so much new demand coming on, like heat pumps and EV charging stations, those are the main ones that cause the disruption. Grid operate like the DNOs, the distribution network operators, are having to claw back that capacity from the existing commercial units that are there. And they're having to do that in a way that's fair to the commercial units, because one of the things that's hard about this long-term planning is that you need to be fair to the people that are already there. Those are called grandfather agreements, where you prioritize the existing customers, but you need to have room to expand. And how do you do that when the money that you can spend on capex or investing in new capacity is limited? So they have to. It's a delicate balance to play, and what they end up doing is it basically incentivizes new businesses to do a lot of demand flex, which is what you'd basically experience as a domestic customer as having your own battery. So they can basically decide when to use their power, and they can do that with batteries. They can do that with their own generation on site, like solar panels on the roof of the business. And specifically solar panels on the roof of a business is good for some sort of business that works 9 to 5, because maybe like light manufacturing, because actually that's when your energy demand is as well. Now this kind of works, and there's enough flexibility in most local areas for businesses to grow, people to install heat pumps, and then some domestic customers get their own EVs. But the thing I want to point out first is that everyone who does this is basically having to protect their future use cases as well. So if a commercial customer gives up some grid capacity to the network operator in exchange for some money back or some cheaper bills in the future, they might not be able to get that capacity back with priority in the future. The same way that if you go to a battery in your house, you may not be able to receive the capacity back maybe in 10 years, or you don't want to have a battery anymore. So there's a real planning issue where you need to basically protect your own demand in the future as well, and that's quite a hard thing to balance. Now I want to say that nowadays with there's normally enough spare capacity to do this sort of incremental policy, okay, but it does put pressure on bills. But with data centers coming in, data centers are a type of demand that is not the same as light industry, and it's not the same as most commercial applications, because data centers are basically provide or require like almost constant power draw over the entire day. So that's overnight and during the day at almost a constant level, but they also require very, very high levels of reliability. So that would be the situation where they would 100% need their own dedicated cable from the substation to the commercial unit, and they'd probably also need to have their own backup generation on site with diesel generators, and the same way that hospitals do, for example, in most situations. Now this is a very strange situation for local grid operators, and a lot of these data centers are going into urban areas. And this can be a problem because basically you need a new commercial unit, you need to make capacity for them, but they can't slot in around other people. And if they put their own solar panels on the roof, it really wouldn't make that much of a dent in terms of the reduction in capacity that they could have, because they need power all the time. So a lot of them are having to put things like their own gas power generation on site. That's called private wire behind the meter, just to make sure they've got that constant generation base load. But they're also going to have these diesel generating backups. So it really comes in to an energy policy landscape that's not ready for it. And the other thing about data centers is that the demand is scaling so much quicker. I mean, 3 years ago, if someone said, "Do you want to invest in Nvidia?" you'd be like, "I don't know, maybe." But now it just seems like an absolute no-brainer, because no one really envisioned 3 years ago, even if you worked in a sector that was using AI, the amount of demand that would scale. And I mean, you could argue that it's kind of irrelevant, but it's become some sort of arms race where everyone just wants more compute, more scale. They want to basically solve these problems by just hitting it with a bigger hammer as possible, and that means large energy usage. Now, a lot of people are basically saying that these large energy usage are going to impact the grid, badly, and the reason that it's impacting more than any other commercial unit is because of the scale that it's happening and because of the type of demand that the data center needs. That constant demand, and it's way more scale, way more quickly than the planning cycles of most distributed network operator businesses. Now, people can see this as a bad thing, and I think that if it impacts your local bills, it could be a bad thing. But I think that these companies are mostly, I mean, I can't speak for actually what's happening on the ground, because I think we've got to wait for a bit more to see. But I would say that in most jurisdictions, the domestic customer is protected in terms of capacity, so it shouldn't be such a massive increase in bills for the local people. And if they are requiring more energy generation, they should be paying for that themselves. And I'm not just saying should be as in they should be, I'm saying that they probably will have to by way of the regulations. But people are saying that obviously if you've got a local gas generation or you've got power lines going into your area, that could negatively affect your house price or your air quality, and those are very, very valid concerns. What I would say about something that's good about the data center expansion is that in this era of grid expansion for net zero, we've got heat pumps, we've got solar panels. I mean, we've got this planning sort of delay with the DNOs not being able to invest quickly enough, and there's not enough pressure to basically build capacity. I don't think we've seen this sort of rapid pressure to expand the network for a very long time, and I think it's a good thing, because increasing capacity is going to allow us to do things that we need to do in net zero, because net zero requires overcapacity building, overcapacity of renewables, overcapacity of transmission networks to make the sort of power solutions possible that we need in the future. And what we've been doing so far with like efficiency, sharing connections and all this sort of thing, it's the wrong time to do that. It's the right time to rapidly expand capacity so that we've got optionality in the future. So that would be an upside for what's happening with data centers right now.